The air in Le Fleur, Nashville's most opulent restaurant, thrummed with a low, luxurious frequency. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables draped in crisp white linen, each setting meticulously arranged with gleaming silverware and delicate china. The murmur of hushed conversations mingled with the soft clinking of glasses, creating a symphony of understated elegance. It was a Saturday night, the kind where the rich velvet chairs seemed to absorb the aspirations and the elegance of the evening. In this dimly lit sanctuary of culinary artistry, every guest seemed to carry themselves with a certain air of importance, as if their tailored suits and designer gowns were mere extensions of their inherent worth. Among the evening's patrons was a man who, at first glance, appeared to be just another face in the crowd. Marcus Preston. Dressed simply, yet with an undeniable air of confidence, he sat with a group of colleagues at a corner booth, bathed in the warm glow of a nearby candle. His attire wasn't flashy, a well-fitted black blazer over a crisp white shirt. But it was the kind of understated elegance that only a man of influence could truly pull off. He wasn't trying to impress, he simply was. His deep laugh echoed through the table as he made a point that was listened to intently, and the soft twinkle in his eye hinted at a man who had seen it all, navigated treacherous landscapes, and was still very much in control of the room. A leader, for one waiter, however, this was just another group of guests to serve. Another table number, another potential tip. Kyle, the young waiter, scanned the table as he approached, mentally running through his checklist for the evening. Bread basket? Check. Water glasses topped off? Check. Upbeat, yet respectful demeanor? Check. His uniform was spotless, pressed within an inch of its life, and his posture was rigidly professional. But there was a certain arrogance in his stride, a subtle disdain that wasn't quite hidden behind his practiced smile. He'd worked hard to get here, at Le Fleur. He believed that he deserved to be among these people. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly as he took in the group, the men in sharp suits, the women with their expensive handbags, the confident ease with which they navigated the menu. And then, there was Marcus. He didn't know who he was. Not yet. All Kyle saw was a man of average build, someone who seemed to purposely be keeping it low-key. No designer labels to flaunt, no ostentatious jewelry, just a simple, well-maintained exterior. An air of modesty that, to Kyle, screamed ordinary. His mind, unfortunately quick to judge, and even quicker to make assumptions, quickly made a judgment, unremarkable. An assumption based solely on appearance. In that moment, he decided to make a joke. A little jab to assert a perceived dominance. "Good evening," Kyle said, placing the water glasses on the table with a slight, almost dismissive air. "I hope you're all enjoying the meal. The steak here is quite impressive. I'd recommend it to anyone who's not afraid to indulge." He paused, glancing at Marcus with a barely concealed smirk, "But of course, you look more like a salad guy." "No offense, sir." A brief silence descended upon the table, the words hanging in the air like a bad aftertaste. The other diners around the table exchanged quick, almost imperceptible glances. Marcus's expression didn't change. His eyes, sharp but calm, locked onto the waiter's face. He remained as still as a statue. Kyle, however, didn't notice. He was already turning to the rest of the table, feeling quite pleased with his own wit, convinced his little comment would pass unnoticed, a harmless joke in the grand scheme of the evening. But Marcus wasn't just any guest. Kyle's arrogance seemed to grow by the second. He didn't even notice the subtle shift in the atmosphere in the room, the way the conversation seemed to pause, the almost imperceptible tightening of the smiles on the faces of Marcus's colleagues. His eyes flicked to his notepad, quickly jotting down the order for the rest of the table, his focus solely on his task. He was too focused on his own perceived superiority, convinced that his quick-witted remark had landed perfectly. After all, this was a luxury restaurant. How could someone like Marcus possibly belong here? Kyle had seen it all before. The rich, the powerful, the CEOs with their tailored suits and their fancy cars, their air of importance, the way the world seemed to bend to their will. He'd grown used to it, this routine of serving those who, in his mind, were the chosen few. He'd convinced himself that he was a gatekeeper of sorts, deciding who was worthy of his attention and who wasn't. He'd been working at this high-end restaurant for almost 2 years now, and to him, the dynamics were simple. The wealthy guests were to be pampered, catered to, and treated with the utmost deference. The rest, those he deemed average, could sit back, enjoy their meal, and receive adequate, but not excessive, service. It was a mentality that had built up over time, layer by layer, fueled by his own insecurities and a desperate need to feel important. Until Kyle had developed a certain disdain for people who didn't meet his self-imposed standards. Sure, the well-off patrons had their importance, they were the ones who paid the bills, after all. But everyone else? They were simply filling up seats. Making up the numbers, a background noise to the symphony of wealth and power. In his mind, it was all too easy to tell who belonged and who didn't. The regulars, they wore the finest brands, carried the most expensive bags, and never hesitated to flash their black credit cards. They demanded attention and received it willingly. The others, they were the ones with modest suits, no fancy accessories, no overt show of wealth. They were polite, unassuming, and easily overlooked. And Marcus? Well, Marcus looked more like someone who had been dragged along to dinner by a more successful friend or colleague, not someone who truly belonged in a room filled with influential figures. Kyle took it a step further. He mentally categorized Marcus as safe. One of those people who maybe didn't have the confidence to step into a world of real power. Perhaps a mid-level manager, or someone who had worked hard his whole life but never quite made it to the top. A cog in the machine, not the driver. Kyle's gaze flitted to the rest of the table, his eyes searching for validation of his assumptions, a silent confirmation that he was right in his assessment of Marcus. But no one else seemed to react to his comment. They were all too busy talking amongst themselves, as though they hadn't heard it at all. Or, perhaps, they were simply too polite to acknowledge his blatant disregard for professional courtesy. The waiter's mind, though, was elsewhere. He casually dropped off the drinks and moved around the table, taking orders with a practiced efficiency, all while keeping his focus on the next task at hand. He didn't expect much from this night. After all, it was just another Friday evening at the restaurant. A chance to serve meals, collect tips, and go home. As he worked, Kyle began to feel a sense of superiority creeping in. He was confident that he'd made a smart remark, a witty observation that had subtly placed him above this particular guest. It wasn't meant to be cruel, just a harmless joke, right? The guest seemed to have laughed it off, after all. He couldn't help but feel a bit proud of himself. It was his job to entertain, to make people feel at ease while they dined. A little bit of levity never hurt anyone, he reasoned. In his mind, Marcus wasn't a threat to his job or his standing at the restaurant. He was just another ordinary guy, someone who wouldn't cause a scene, someone who would quietly accept his place in the social hierarchy. The rich and powerful didn't need to be respected, they just needed to be served. But Marcus knew better than to make assumptions. The evening carried on as normal. Kyle continued his rounds, checking in on the other tables, delivering plates of food, and occasionally exchanging polite banter with the more familiar guests. But the atmosphere around Marcus's table seemed to shift. The light conversation that had filled the air moments ago began to fade. There was a slight tension in the air. It wasn't until the end of the meal, when Marcus reached for his wallet, that everything began to change. He stood up, a subtle yet commanding presence in the room, and looked over at the host to settle the bill. As he did, the host's eyes widened, his jaw slackening almost imperceptibly. He suddenly recognized the man standing before him. "Mr. Preston," the host stammered, his voice filled with sudden respect. "It's an honor to have you here tonight. I didn't realize you were dining with us." Kyle froze, his back still to the table, as he prepared to head back to the kitchen. The name, Preston, rang through his mind. He'd heard it before, but where? The confusion didn't last long. The host quickly stepped aside to let Marcus make his way to the register, his deference practically radiating from his pores. The realization hit Kyle like a cold wave. He turned around just in time to see Marcus smile politely as he pulled out a sleek black credit card, the type of card that only belonged to people who were at the very top of the food chain. It wasn't a card that most people could even dream of possessing. In that moment, the entire room seemed to shift. Kyle's stomach dropped as he realized just who he'd been serving. Marcus Preston, founder of Innovate Tech, one of the country's most successful tech companies. His name was everywhere, on the front pages of magazines, in news articles, and in the emails of industry leaders. He was the kind of person who built billion-dollar empires with his vision and determination. A self-made man. And here he was, in this very restaurant, sitting right under Kyle's nose. The waiter stood frozen for a second, his mind racing, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The words he had spoken to Marcus echoed in his head. Louder now than they ever had been. "You look more like a salad guy." His face burned with embarrassment, his palms suddenly sweaty. Kyle had made a fool of himself, and in the worst possible way. This wasn't just any guest, this was a man whose influence extended far beyond what Kyle could even comprehend. A man who could probably buy and sell Le Fleur 10 times over without batting an eye. Kyle could feel the heat rising in his chest as the realization hit him harder than a slap to the face. The arrogance that had once filled his steps now felt heavy, oppressive. The smugness of his earlier comments seemed to mock him now, a constant reminder of his own stupidity. Now he wanted to disappear. To somehow rewind the evening and undo the careless words that had slipped from his lips. But it was too late. The damage was done. The rest of the room seemed to watch, suspended in a silent tableau, as the situation unfolded. The quiet murmurs of the other diners had stopped. People glanced at each other, some exchanging knowing looks, others silently judging the moment. They too had noticed the sudden shift, the dramatic unveiling of Marcus's true identity. Marcus had been a regular diner in the restaurant for months, always visiting when he was in town on business. But this time, something was different. The moment was electric with tension. Kyle, still standing motionless, could only watch as Marcus finished his transaction. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with regret. He had made assumptions, he had judged someone based on nothing more than appearance. Now he was left with nothing but the bitter taste of his own arrogance. He could almost feel the eyes of the other diners boring into him, their silent judgment a weight he couldn't bear. The host gave Kyle a quick, sympathetic glance, and then, in a move that felt too swift, ushered Marcus out of the restaurant. The doors closed behind him with a soft chime, and just like that, the reality of the situation sunk in. The world Kyle had so comfortably lived in had been turned upside down. But the real question was, what would happen next? The silence in the restaurant felt almost unbearable after Marcus left. The energy that had filled the room only moments before seemed to dissipate into thin air, leaving behind a hush of tension that clung to the walls like a damp shroud. Kyle could feel it pressing against him. Heavier than the fancy suit he was wearing, a physical manifestation of his own shame. The wait staff moved more slowly now, their usual buzz of conversation and laughter gone, replaced by the muffled sound of footsteps and the faint clatter of silverware. No one was saying anything, but they didn't need to. It was in the eyes of the other diners, the way they watched Kyle now, some with pity, others with judgment. It was as though they could see straight through him, as if they knew exactly what had just happened. Kyle could hardly bear it. He stood by the kitchen doors, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and regrets. He replayed the moment over and over in his head, each time the sting of his words to Marcus growing sharper. He could almost hear them again, echoing in his ears. "You look more like a salad guy." How could he have been so foolish? How could he have assumed something about Marcus without even trying to understand who he was? He hadn't even bothered to ask his name. The fact that he had been so quick to judge was the reason why he felt so bad in this present moment. The manager, Andrew, walked over to him with a raised eyebrow. Kyle had worked under Andrew for almost a year now, and he respected him. But there was something in his eyes that Kyle had never seen before. It wasn't anger, no. That would have been easier to deal with. It was disappointment. A deep-seated, palpable disappointment. You know who that was, right? Andrew asked, his tone flat but firm. Kyle nodded, his throat tight. Yeah. I didn't realize. He wanted to explain himself, to justify his actions somehow, but the words wouldn't come. What could he say? That he judged someone based on the way they looked? That was the truth, but it wasn't an excuse. Andrew let out a small, disappointed sigh. Marcus Preston is one of the most respected names in tech. You just insulted him in front of a full restaurant. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. You embarrassed yourself, Kyle. Kyle's stomach twisted. He had embarrassed himself, but even worse, he had embarrassed the restaurant. This wasn't just any mistake. It was a mistake that could affect his career, his livelihood. The thought of it made him feel nauseous. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that, Kyle stammered, feeling small and exposed. It was just a joke, Andrew. I didn't know. Andrew's eyes softened a little, but the disappointment was still clear. It doesn't matter whether you knew or not. It's about how you treat people. And right now, you've shown exactly what kind of person you are. Kyle lowered his head, unable to meet Andrew's gaze. He knew there was no way to take back what he had said. The damage was done, and no amount of apologies could erase the sting of his own ignorance. He knew he was going to have to live with this mistake for a long time to come. As the evening wore on, Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was watching him, waiting for him to slip up again. He could hear the quiet murmurs among the waitstaff, the barely disguised gossip that had started to spread like wildfire. He finished his shift in a daze, moving through the motions as if he was on autopilot. The customers had long since left, and the restaurant was almost empty save for the cleaning crew and a few lingering staff members. Kyle grabbed his coat from the back room, his shoulders slumped in defeat, but just as he was about to leave, Andrew called after him. Kyle, he said, his voice softer now. This isn't the end of it. But you've got to do better. It's time to learn from this. Kyle nodded without speaking, his mind still reeling. He walked out of the restaurant that night, his head full of self-loathing and regret. It wasn't just about the mistake he had made. It was about the realization that his actions had consequences, ones that would stretch far beyond the walls of Le Fleur, but this was just the beginning of his journey toward redemption. The following days were a blur of self-reflection and regret for Kyle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Marcus Preston's calm expression, the polite smile that barely masked the hurt behind it. He replayed his mistake in his head like a broken record, each spin of the wheel making the shame feel heavier, more suffocating. He couldn't stop thinking about how he had treated someone based solely on assumptions, how his words had exposed his deep-seated biases without him even realizing it. Kyle's nights were restless. He thought about what Andrew had said, about how it wasn't just the insult that mattered, but the way he had treated another human being. How many others had he made feel small or invisible because of his assumptions? How many times had he dismissed someone's worth based on superficial factors? It made him sick to think about it. He didn't want to be that person anymore. But what could he do now? The damage was done. He had insulted a powerful man in front of an entire restaurant, and there was no undoing that. Kyle found himself pacing his small apartment late into the night, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew one thing for sure, he couldn't just let this slide. He needed to take responsibility. To show that he was willing to learn and change. He wasn't going to be that waiter who judged people and lived with that regret for the rest of his life. The next day, as Kyle stood in front of the mirror preparing for another shift, he made up his mind. He was going to find Marcus and apologize face to face. No more hiding behind excuses, no more letting his pride get in the way. He had to make things right, no matter how uncomfortable it made him. No matter what people thought about him, he needed to do this for himself. He owed it to himself. He waited for the perfect moment. It wasn't easy, but the opportunity finally came when he learned that Marcus would be dining at the restaurant again just a few days later. The night felt like it was stretching before him, a long, uncertain road. Kyle was nervous. His palms were sweating, and his heart was pounding as he prepared to face Marcus again. But there was no turning back now. He had to do this. He had to confront his past and pave the way for a better future. As Marcus entered the restaurant that evening, Kyle spotted him almost immediately. He looked the same as he had before, composed, dignified, and entirely unaware of the internal struggle that was happening within the waiter. It was almost as if Marcus had forgotten about the encounter altogether, but Kyle could never forget that night. Kyle swallowed hard and walked up to him. He cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. "Mr. Preston," Kyle began, his voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to apologize for the way I treated you last time. The comment I made. It was inappropriate, and it was wrong. I was out of line." Marcus turned to look at him, his expression unreadable for a moment. Kyle could feel his heart race, but he forced himself to hold eye contact. The silence stretched on, and Kyle wondered if he would just be dismissed, or if Marcus would simply brush it off. But then, to his surprise, Marcus spoke. "You're right," he said quietly. "It was wrong. But I appreciate you coming to me. That's not easy." Kyle felt a small sense of relief wash over him. At least Marcus wasn't angry, at least he was listening. But that wasn't enough. He had to go further. He had to show that he truly understood the weight of what he had done. "I was wrong to judge you based on how you looked, Mr. Preston," Kyle continued, his voice shaking just a little. "I've spent so much time thinking about it, and I realize now that I've been walking around with blinders on, thinking I knew who people were just by looking at them. But I don't. And I want to change that." Marcus nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "It takes a lot of courage to admit when you've made a mistake," he said, his voice calm and measured. "It's not always easy to face the things we've done wrong, but it's the first step toward doing better." Kyle felt a lump form in his throat, but he nodded. He was starting to understand what Marcus was saying. This wasn't just about the apology. It was about the willingness to grow, to be better, and to change the way he saw the world. "Thank you," Kyle said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll do better. I promise." Marcus smiled faintly. "That's all anyone can ask for. Just do better." Kyle walked away from that conversation with a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was the beginning of something new. He didn't expect immediate forgiveness, nor did he expect to forget what he had done. But he had taken responsibility, and in doing so, he had started to change, not just for Marcus, but for himself. The waiter was starting to see the world for how it was. His arrogance and closed-mindedness were starting to subside. He was opening the doors to his own mind and learning about himself in the process. In the weeks that followed, something changed in Kyle. It wasn't immediately obvious, not to the people around him, or even to himself at first. But slowly, as the days passed, Kyle found himself noticing things that he had never paid attention to before, small moments, little details, like the way people interacted with him, or how his coworkers treated each other. He began to see beyond the surface, realizing how many times he had made assumptions about people, how many times he had failed to truly understand the stories of those around him. Marcus Preston's apology had been the catalyst for this shift. That one simple conversation had forced Kyle to look inward, to face the biases he had built up over the years, and confront them head-on. but it wasn't enough to just say the words. He had to show, through his actions, that he was committed to changing. It started with small steps. He made an effort to listen more intently to the people he served, to ask questions about their lives, and listen to their answers. He no longer judged them based on how they looked or what they wore. Instead, he focused on who they were as individuals. He treated each guest with the respect they deserved, not because of their appearance or social status, but because of their humanity. Kyle also took it upon himself to start conversations with his coworkers, opening up in a way he hadn't before. He found that many of them shared similar struggles, similar insecurities. It wasn't just about serving food or getting tips, it was about understanding each other, recognizing the shared experiences that connected them. They weren't just employees at a restaurant, they were people, each with their own hopes, dreams, and challenges. He was starting to see the bigger picture. As time went on, Kyle started to feel a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't experienced before. He was no longer living in the bubble of his own narrow world, but instead, opening himself up to the lives of others. His relationships with his coworkers improved, and he noticed that the guests seemed to respond to him differently too. There was a warmth in his interactions that hadn't been there before, an authenticity that came from genuinely caring about the people he served. It was a remarkable change from the inside out. One evening, as he was leaving the restaurant after another shift, Kyle bumped into Marcus again. This time, the encounter was different. There was no awkwardness, no tension. Kyle smiled as he saw Marcus approach. "Mr. Preston," Kyle greeted him, his voice confident but respectful. "It's good to see you again." Marcus returned the smile, nodding. "Good to see you too, Kyle. How's everything been going?" Kyle didn't hesitate. "It's been going well. I've been making an effort to be more aware of how I treat people, and it's been eye-opening." "You were right when you said that it takes courage to face our mistakes." Marcus seemed genuinely pleased by the admission. "I'm glad to hear that," he said, his expression warm. "That's all we can do. Try to do better every day." As they parted ways, Kyle couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not because of what he had done, but because he had begun to understand something much deeper, the power of empathy, the importance of seeing people for who they truly are, not for how they appear on the outside. He was starting to become a better person from the inside out. The journey wasn't over. Kyle knew that it would take time to fully undo the years of conditioning, the biases that had shaped the way he viewed the world. But now he was on the right path, and that in itself was something worth striving for. The experience had taught him more than he could have imagined. It wasn't just about an apology or a mistake. It was about growth, redemption, and the realization that we all have the capacity to change. We all have the ability to see the world in a new light, to make the conscious choice to be better. As Kyle stepped into the world with new eyes, he understood that no matter who we are or where we come from, we all deserve respect. Not because of the labels others place on us, but because we are human. The world of Le Fleur would never look the same to him again. So what about you? Have you ever judged someone based on assumptions? Have you ever had the courage to admit your mistakes and learn from them? Share your thoughts, and remember, growth starts with us. Change starts with you. The decision to see the world in a new light lies with you. Are you ready to take that step?